Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Author Series conversation. I'm Kim Conheiser-Freeman, Executive Director of the Women's Foreign Policy Group, a network of international affairs professionals dedicated to advancing women's leadership, amplifying their voices through substantive global issues programming like today's discussion, and preparing the next generation for leadership through programs like our newly launched virtual mentorship program. And of course, all of our professional development programs throughout the year. I'm delighted to welcome Nina Jankowicz, I already did it wrong, Jankowicz, and Ellen Nakashima for today's timely conversation on Russian-backed disinformation campaigns and Nina's newly released book, How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict. As with all of our programs, we want to include all of your questions as well, so you can send them in at any point during the conversation using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and Ellen will include as many as she can. Nina is the Disinformation Fellow at the Wilson Center's Science Technology Innovation Program and is a frequent commentator on disinformation, as well as Russian and Eastern European affairs. Today's conversation will be led by Ellen Nakashima, an award-winning journalist who covers intelligence and cyber operations for the Washington Post, including the investigation into Russian interference and the 2016 presidential election and the whistleblower complaint over President Trump's dealing with the Ukraine. We're delighted to welcome you back. Thank you, Ellen. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thanks to the Women's Foreign Policy Group for hosting this. It's great to be here and to see you, Nina. Your book really resonated with me, and I guess I just wanted to start by saying, so for so many Americans, modern cyber-enabled Russian information operations began with 2016. They were oblivious to the fact that the Soviet Union has been interfering in American elections for decades, and that when it comes to online interference, Russia has been at it since at least 2007 with Estonia. Your book covers many of those seminal events that led to, from 2016, from Estonia to Georgia to the Czech Republic. Why did you set out to write this book, and what is the main message you want to convey?
Well, thank you so much, Ellen, for moderating this discussion. It's really an honor to be appearing with you and to the Women's Foreign Policy Group for hosting events like this and supporting young women in the field. We need more diverse, more female voices in national security. So it's really just an honor to be here, first of all. I decided to write this book when I was working in Ukraine. I was working as a strategic communications advisor to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry under a Fulbright grant. And I was there during the 2016 election cycle. And watching all of that unfold from Kyiv, where they had been dealing with Russian information warfare, Russian actual kinetic warfare for the past 2 years when I got there. And the fact that the West was, waking up to this threat only when it was happening to them was just kind of a sad thing to see. It was like we had totally ignored the past 10 years of history in Central and Eastern Europe. And so I had been traveling around talking to a lot of colleagues around the region, and really just thought that there was a lot to learn from them, a lot to learn from their responses. And I set to tell that in an interesting and accessible way, because so often, Eastern Europe is painted in stereotypes, and cyber and disinformation work is done in a way that's really not accessible to normal people. So I wanted to present something that anybody could pick up and be interested in, but also that held some policy implications for our discussion and our countering of Russian and other disinformation. So the main thrust of the book is that, we need to have people at the center of our responses here. The Russia report in the UK was just released today. And something I've been saying a lot is, that report is great. It's very clear and cogent, but it securitizes the problem. Obviously, this is a national security issue, but it's also a people issue, because what Russia does is manipulate the fissures in our societies, our real grievances, our real emotions, to pit us against one another. And until we heal that stuff, it's really impossible to get ahead of this problem. And the most resilient nations that I cover in the book are the ones that realize that.
That's the message that really resonated with me too, is that in order to get at this problem, we have to focus, turn inward, look at what ails us, the fissures that we've created. But so one of your themes or messages is that the United States can learn from Eastern Europe and not repeat its mistakes. Can you just give us one or two examples of what Russia did in one of the countries you studied, and what these countries did wrong, what mistakes we should not repeat? What are the lessons we can take away from the way these countries responded?
Sure. So one that's really topical is Poland and the Polish elections. So my last name, as I'm sure everyone has noticed, is Polish. Poland is a country that is near and dear to my heart. And every time I've gone there for research or for pleasure, you know, one thing you hear over and over is, oh, we are inoculated here in Poland to Russian disinformation. But that could not be farther from the truth. One thing that Poland has unfortunately done wrong, even though that in their national security doctrine, they are very clear about the Russian threat, they use disinformation on their own people. The Law and Justice government, which has just won the presidential election last week, has been proven to use bots and trolls in order to drive home divisive political messages and kind of increase their support. That might sound familiar to many of the Americans who are on the line right now, because we're seeing something very similar in the United States today. And disinformation knows no political party. The Russians aren't scrupulous about who they're supporting and who they're not supporting, as long as it's driving division in society. So by ignoring that domestic disinformation threat, Poland has left itself open to foreign interference. And that's been particularly prevalent in the case of the Smolensk plane crash, which killed President Lech Kaczynski in 2010. And the Russians have used as one particular disinformation narrative about conspiracies and driving polls against one another. So we're seeing similar things playing out in the United States right now. And then another example is Ukraine and the Netherlands referendum on Ukraine's association agreement in 2016, which is just a fascinating case study for me, because it shows how Russia, again, weaponizes these pre-existing grievances in society. So the Dutch are very Eurosceptic, especially with the MH17 tragedy that killed many Dutch citizens. They were hesitant to further integrate Ukraine into the European Union. And lo and behold, this opportunity presented itself to Russia, where the Dutch were holding a referendum on that association agreement with Ukraine. And they saw two opportunities there. One, to undermine support for Ukraine in the European Union and the international community writ large. And two, to undermine European unity, to undermine EU cohesion. And they did this through information laundering by planting different anti-Ukraine narratives in the Netherlands media environment. They did it through money laundering by supporting Dutch political parties who were against the referendum. And they also even sent folks on the ground to town halls to discuss these issues, pretending to be Ukrainians with Ukraine's best interests in their minds. And it just shows the breadth of what Russian influence looks like. You know, we talk about disinformation, we talk about cyber attacks, but it's actually a very multifaceted phenomenon. And I think that's a big misconception that we have in the United States.
And that's a big attack surface too. I mean, it's just that there's so many different areas that we need to work on and focus on if we're going to try to counter it. You also kind of take on the conventional wisdom about how to combat foreign influence, arguing that certain strategies don't work, just among them fact-checking, strategic communications, and what you call whack-a-troll, or deleting inauthentic accounts. Can you just briefly explain what these are and why they aren't the answer?
Sure. So I think all of them can be part of the answer, but there's almost been kind of a messianic adherence to fact checking, thinking that it's going to cure all of society's ills. And I saw this in Ukraine in particular, where there's a very prominent fact checker called StopFake, and they do great work about countering the Russian narrative, but it's only resonant within parts of society that want to hear it. In fact, I'm sure you've seen this in your own work. You know, the fact checkers that we have here in the United States have increasingly been kind of pulled up into political debate. You know, if you drop a Snopes link, or even something that the Washington Post fact checker Glenn Kessler has done, folks don't want to hear it. They're like, oh no, that's part of the deep state, or, you know, that's a politicized fact check. We don't have a real shared understanding of what the facts are, which means that fact checking in and of itself gets undermined sometimes. And there's also psychological research that shows, you know, once you hear an incorrect piece of information, a fact check can actually really pound that into your mind. You don't remember the correct information. You're more likely to remember the incorrect stuff. So there's some question about the efficacy of it. But it can be useful for people who want to orient themselves in the information environment. It's just not a panacea. Strategic communications, on the other hand, and we hear this a lot in the defense sector especially, folks say, you know, we just need a new narrative for NATO. We just need a better narrative to fight against Russian disinformation. But if you look at the Ukraine example that I was just talking about, Ukraine Ukraine tried to launch a very clever, positive, strategic communications campaign in the Netherlands, but it's so difficult to undermine people's real emotional responses to these things. You can't just say, you know, we're going to have great economic relations. Ukraine buys a lot of Dutch tulips. So look how we contribute to the Netherlands society, and undermine that really deep-seated EU skepticism, for instance. And similar things are really difficult to undermine here in the United States. You know, a Russian narrative about endemic racism in the United States. First of all, there is endemic racism. Second of all, it's hard to undermine people's real feelings that have been, again, seeded over decades and decades of lived experience. A good story is not necessarily going to change that. And then whack-a-troll, which is my favorite term. You know, we've been so focused on the social media platforms, and frankly, with good reason. They've not done enough, and they've acted too slow when they have acted. Mm-hmm. But we cannot just think that we're going to remove fake accounts, remove what we see as malign content, and solve the problem, because it's very cheap for bad actors to put this stuff out there. I like to say that disinformation has become democratized. All you really need is a social media account, sometimes a credit card, and if you're smart, you don't even need that. All you need is a knowledge of how the emotional content on the platform travels to make it trend. And so really it is like the carnival game of whack-a-mole. Every time you put something on, it gets taken down, and another one or 10 more will pop up. It's just very easy to do. So we need something that's more systemic and that helps people separate the good from the bad online, or the trustworthy from the untrustworthy.
Okay, so what can we do about it? And what has Poland or Estonia or Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic, Ukraine, has any one of those countries come up with an approach or strategy that has effectively diffused some of this information operations effort?
Well, nobody has won the information war. I think I'd have a different title to the book if that were the case. But I think Estonia has, you know, perhaps by virtue of the fact that they've been at it the longest, they've come the closest. They have that balanced, kinetic national security approach with a very people-centric approach as well. They've invested in education. So in Estonia, the Russian ethnic population is kind of the societal fissure that Russia is manipulating. They've tried to integrate that population. So those grievances that existed in 2007 are trying to be kind of eliminated from society. They're trying to offer more educational opportunities for ethnic Russians, more career opportunities, offering Estonian language classes in environments that Russians will actually seek them out in, offering higher education opportunities, and also investing in Russian language media, which is something I think, of course, that's very specific to the Estonian environment, but investing in media is an important, I like to call it the connective tissue in our societies, right? In the Estonian environment, that means dealing with the Russian ethnic population, but in the United States, that might look like investing more in our public media and NPR and PBS, which across the country in news deserts, they are some of the only stations that are covering local news for those pockets of the country. When several, I think up to 30 states no longer have reporters on Capitol Hill, no longer have that lens about what's going on in big cities interpreted for that local context. And when that vacuum exists, it's filled with something else. So those would be the two big things that I would say are really important. Investing in people, investing in education, helping people navigate the information environment, and then providing them with information. Journalism as a public service is so important.
What about social media companies themselves? What more can they be doing and should they be doing to try to counter some of this disinformation that we're seeing?
Well, I think they're starting to step up again, but from my work in Ukraine in particular during the 2019 presidential election, when Zelensky was elected, we saw some of the tactics that Facebook is trying to use in our 2020 election here in the United States, and they were very, I would say, spottily enforced across the board. The ad library that is supposed to add transparency to the political ad process, there are a lot of loopholes that can be exploited there. And also the problem with many of these social media platforms is the very business model that they operate on. The fact that disinformers, whether they're foreign or domestic, can target individual kind of small slices of the population with the message that they will be most vulnerable to. And they can test that over time and really identify that message that's going to be most resonant. That is something, unfortunately, that we can't leave up to the social media platforms. We're going to need regulation, and Congress has absolutely abdicated its responsibility in that regard. The fact that we, 4 years after the 2016 election, have not passed the Honest Ads Act, which would give that modicum of transparency to our political ads online. I mean, that's the first step, and then there needs to be a lot more after that. There need to be audits of algorithms and audits of their advertising practices. And frankly, you know, things like Facebook groups are also being manipulated by bad actors, foreign and domestic. And Facebook is actually incentivizing that behavior, incentivizing people to kind of exist in these smaller, more extremist areas online. And again, that's something where we need some real federal oversight and consequences for the social media platforms if we find they're not enforcing their own terms of service.
Right. So Congress should step up. Now, what about the role of the U.S. government itself? You know, your case studies focused on overt civilian sphere influence operations, but what Russia has often sought to do is covert through hacking and dumping, or creating fake personas who masquerade as Americans or pro-Russian Ukrainian patriots. How should governments respond to such covert operations, and how specifically should our U.S. government be responding? What more should they be doing? And, you know, should it go up to the the president himself, the bully pulpit?
Yeah, well, certainly I wish that on, you know, day one from the Trump administration, we had heard a clear message about the threat that foreign interference poses. It's been far from that. And I have to say, there is good work happening around the US government on this issue, but most of it is undermined by the messages that we're hearing coming from the White House. That is kind of my daily sadness. But you know, I think the stuff that we've got going, the Global Engagement Center at the State Department is doing some good work, but it's focused abroad, right? It's focused on populations in Russia's near abroad. It's not focused on Americans, and that's by virtue of the funding that the Global Engagement Center gets. The folks at the Department of Homeland Security, Chris Krebs and his team, I think are doing a good job, but they're a small team. It's just a couple of people who are working on, you know, protecting our election infrastructure, looking at disinformation online, and also somehow educating the public. That's a lot for just a few people to be doing. And we've really not invested the human or monetary resources that I think we need to in this problem. And again, we're also securitizing the problem, just like the Brits have done. These are, you know, national security organs that are dealing with this stuff. I would love to see the Department of Education involved. I would love to see grants going to libraries and civil society organizations who are doing nonpartisan education about media and digital literacy. And these are generational approaches. That's true. You know, no politician wants to sign on to a program that's going to last or take 10 years. But Russia has been at this for much longer than that. And we are squandering valuable time as we debate whether or not, you know, media literacy works. And there is proof that it works. So that's the sort of investment that I think we need to start seeing, making that kind of whole of government, whole of society approach a reality.
I completely agree with you. And as a national security reporter, I'm really glad to hear you talk about that. Do you think, in fact, that going beyond the security measures we can take and the efforts that Congress can make to regulate social media, I mean, you know, what you're suggesting is that we need to really get at the fundamental problems and fissures in our society, which are rooted in social and economic racial injustice and inequality, right? And disparities among educational districts, as well as in healthcare and in environment. And those are huge problems, and, you know, can't be solved in like one, you know, congressional term. So how do we get at it? And is that really what is in the end, going to address the vulnerabilities we have.
Well, I think so. I hope so. I mean, otherwise, what's the democratic project about, right? We need to recognize that we haven't arrived and that we can always do better in search of that more perfect union. And that, you know, those sorts of investments, domestic investments, are going to protect us and create a more prosperous environment, not only domestically here in the United States, but abroad as well. That image, you know, that image of the shining city on a hill, to invoke Reagan, is something that inspires democratic activists around the world. I know that because I used to work with them when I worked at the National Democratic Institute, right? That's something to aspire to. And when folks are are trying to imitate that, when we're putting that best foot forward and saying, you know, we're going to try to make adjustments in the way that we approach race in this country, and really, you know, absolve for our sins, try to, you know, make real adjustments and not just give it lip service. That makes everybody safer overall. And I truly believe in that our democratic values need to be at the heart of any of these responses when we're talking about it, domestic or foreign. And certainly it seems that we've lost sight of that recently.
Great. Now, I also wanted to ask if you had any thoughts on other countries. You focused on Russia-backed campaigns, but Iran and China are also key players. And during the pandemic, there were reports that China and Iran were amplifying each other's allegations that the U.S. had initiated the coronavirus pandemic. Do you see China and Iran getting into the online influence operation game in as big a way as Russia? And if so, with what implications or what differences? Any thoughts?
Sure. I think the Russian playbook has been cracked open for everyone to see, and it's not just foreign interference, right? We have domestic actors who are very much mimicking those exact same tactics. So something that I've been saying is that we need to, you know, really be equal opportunity disinformation counterers, and we've not really gotten to that point here in the United States. Yeah, I've seen over the past couple of months, certainly China especially, engaging in that sort of same Russian playbook. Unfortunately for China, I think that they're not quite as practiced at it yet. They are using kind of more typical vectors of soft power, so official diplomatic accounts, official propaganda networks, et cetera. And when they are using fake accounts, which we saw actually during the Hong Kong protests, the initial round of them, and we're seeing again now, it's kind of sloppy. It's not able to really resonate with US audiences the same way that Russian disinformation has been able to. And I think that's because ultimately the Chinese goal, especially with regard to Hong Kong and COVID, is to advance the Chinese view, the Chinese line on things, whereas Russia's not so interested in that. Russia just wants to create this chaos that benefits Russia because we're so distracted by our internal issues. And that's what I see as kind of the main difference in strategy. And I would put Iran a little bit farther behind China in terms of its adoption and alacrity with those tactics as well.
And the other big point that comes across in your book that I heartily endorse is that in a way it's the domestic and homegrown voices that we need to pay attention to, because in fact I think in some cases they are the ones that are having the most impact, and the foreign actors exploit that. The gravest mistake you say all countries have made is ignoring the use of domestic actors and disinformation to amplify existing conflict. But what do we do about that? And especially in the United States, you know, where we have the First Amendment, how does the government diffuse such domestic disinformation without running afoul of the First Amendment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't want anybody on this call to get me wrong. I don't want social media platforms to have that right, and I don't want the government to have that right. Both of those are a very scary thing to me as an American. What I would like is more transparency about information and how it gets to us. So again, I talked about the Honest Ads Act before. That's step one. We also need some campaign kind of rules of the road for online interaction, online advertising, because right now it's kind of a disincentive to not be using disinformation if you're in a political campaign. Everybody who's using it certainly has an advantage because it works. That emotional content gets people involved. And we really need to take a step back from that. But of course, political campaigns are only a sliver of the problem. elections are an inflection point in disinformation campaigns, but they go on for a very, very long time. So again, I think this is where we get back to really equipping people with the tools that they need to kind of understand when they're being emotionally manipulated, whether that information is coming from a campaign or a news outlet that doesn't have actual news or, even-handed information at heart. And that's unfortunately a lot of what we're seeing online these days. So I've been telling people, especially during COVID, to practice informational distancing. If you feel yourself getting emotional about a piece of content, it's best to just walk away for a little bit, especially before you hit share. And then if you have some lingering questions later on, you can do some lateral reading about, is this source something that's trustworthy? Is this article even current? What is this image? If I do a reverse image search on this image, is it misattributed? All these things are things that people can learn without, really in-depth knowledge of open source investigation. And it's stuff that will lend more legitimacy and equality to our online discourse.
And what about the media's role in covering disinformation? What is your critique? What can it do? What has it done wrong? What can it do better? And how do you deal with certain outlets that actually wittingly or unwittingly amplify disinformation?
Yeah, I think the media has been pretty introspective about its role in spreading disinformation in the 2016 election, and that is heartening to see. I think in particular, we saw the coverage of, for instance, hacked information. I think they've become a bit more introspective about what to do with that and the context that readers need to understand where it's coming from, that it was illegally obtained in many cases. I think that's key. I think that there is a greater conversation that needs to be had about whether we should be reporting on things like that at all.
Are you saying we shouldn't? I'm just curious to know what your position is on
I
that.
think there really needs to be public interest at its heart. And I'm not sure that that was always the case in 2016. I mean, we're talking about John Podesta's risotto recipe.
Right?
Yeah.
I not have crossed the threshold, hit the bar, but
yeah.
Certainly Hillary Clinton's closed-door speeches to Wall Street bankers was legitimate and newsworthy.
Yes, yeah. But again, I think in some cases we lacked that context. And then there's also cases, there was a New York Times story a couple of months ago about how Russia has always used health disinformation, and it tracked one specific very kind of fringe Twitter account with 5,000 followers. And really amplified what I think was an account that was at best marginal, in the paper of record in the United States.
Right.
And I think that was a mistake. That was an editorial mistake, and the media need to be very careful about not giving extra oxygen to stuff that just doesn't matter. We don't need to debunk and shed light on every bit of Russian disinformation or every bit of disinformation, period, because it's all out there. And in terms of, what we should do about media outlets that are wittingly or unwittingly sharing this information, I think better enforcement in terms of the Foreign Agents Registration Act is one that we can, use for witting agents of disinformation who are actively editorially collaborating with, let's say, RT Sputnik or the MFA of the Russian Federation. In terms of unwitting agents, I think it's about awareness building. And that's why things like the Mueller report and the Senate investigations that have come out, which, put all of this in context, is really important for Americans to understand, that this sort of information laundering does happen. It's important for journalists as well. And I think that is gradually happening. We're adjusting for the disinformation environment in how we do our reporting.
Good. And looking ahead to 2020, what are your fears or your concerns or, scenarios for what might happen?
There's a couple. So like I mentioned before, I've been really focused on closed spaces online. So whether that's closed Facebook groups or encrypted messengers, I am worried about those spaces because they don't have the oversight. The populations there are already segmented into vulnerable groups that are easily targeted against. And, you know, it's just really difficult to put a lid on that stuff as it's spreading, because by the time we hear about it, it's usually already been spreading underground for a very long time. So I'm worried about that. And I think it's important to message to all voters that just because you're in a local group of local moms or, you know, local soccer players or whatever your interest is, it doesn't mean that the folks that are in that group are necessarily all actually local, or that they have, you know, your kind of shared interests at heart. And in fact, it makes you an easy target. So don't necessarily trust that information more just because it's in a smaller space online, because it actually just makes you easier to target. The second thing I'm worried about, and something I really hope to see some messaging from federal and state governments, although I'm not getting my hopes up, is the actual from 8 p.m. on election night to the next morning or whenever results are announced. Right. We are so used to, as Americans, getting an instantaneous result for our elections, and that's not going to happen this year with mail-in ballots. And that's a huge opportunity for any disinformer, whether domestic or foreign, to kind of cast doubt on the legitimacy of the results. And so I think it's important to message that that is not going to be the case this year, that we are not going to have an instantaneous result. That doesn't cast any doubt on the legitimacy of the process. It's just going to take longer. And actually, that's how it is in many other countries where they have mostly paper ballots as well, and they're counting things by hand. So we really need to message against that and protect against any crazy rumors that start to fly on election night. I look at, the Iowa caucus results from February, and how that one rumor about the integrity of the app that was used to calculate the results just took off overnight. That's the sort of thing that we just don't trust any information on election night. And when it does come out, it better be from the FEC or state election boards. That's who I would trust, not politicians and pundits.
Great. I've got a couple of questions here, so I'm going to lay them on you. Are there international groups that act independently to validate reporting? If so, are they viewed as legitimate in the he said, she said realm of media?
There are a couple of international fact-checking organizations. I don't think most normal people know about them, unfortunately. And then, there are a couple efforts by organizations like the United Nations to get involved with fact-checking. I think they're pretty nascent and haven't really gotten traction yet, unfortunately. More international cooperation, particularly when we're talking about foreign interference against the West writ large, would be great, but there is a lot of divergence in the way that states in NATO, for instance, approach Russia. We have, Hungary and Turkey and Italy, which are pretty cordial with Russia compared to what the UK and the US do, for instance. So it makes it really difficult to put out united messaging on that front. And that's something that the whole international community could stand to improve upon, I think.
Okay. And there are a lot of good policy ideas out there, but if the White House doesn't change hands in January, are there local approaches that we could focus on? Are there other options?
Yeah, I think there are some groups who are looking into this. I know one program in particular that is looking at local media literacy efforts. It's run by the International Research and Exchanges Board, IREX, which they're doing, I think, a program in Camden, New Jersey, and another program somewhere in the Southwest. I forget exactly which town, but they're looking at those local approaches to media literacy. I know some states have started to put this into their curriculum. That's really great, but I always say we need to also reach voting age populations, not just kids, because kids are actually pretty good at this stuff compared to, the older generations. So I'd like to see more of that. I don't think all hope is lost. And the media, of course, plays a huge role in this, continuing to shine a light on the things that are going on in Washington and, that might otherwise get brushed under the carpet. The Fourth Estate continues to be critical in that regard.
Yeah, okay. You suggest that people should practice informational distancing. How do we encourage people to do so when so many are entrenched in their own information bubbles and ideology and consuming their news all through social media and online platforms?
Yeah, so this I think actually needs to be like a face-to-face outreach, and another thing that I have trouble practicing myself sometimes. We tend to get in these arguments online. It's really not a fruitful thing to do because people are entrenched when you're having this argument in a public space. So if you see a friend or a family member who's sharing something that you know to be potentially false, I suggest you either message them or pick up the phone, talk to them face-to-face if that's ever a thing anymore, and approach them that way, rather than leaving a public comment, because they're likely to get entrenched that way. And then you can just lead them to some, very easy, like kind of heuristics in terms of how to check this information and see if it's from a reputable source. Of course, there are going to be people who we're not able to reach. There are people who are on the fringes of both sides of the spectrum who just don't want to hear it. And for some people, that's, we just have to not engage, I guess. But there are people in the middle, and I think that's the majority of Americans who want to know more about this stuff. And it's incumbent on friends and family to lead them there in a respectful way. And I think we've lost a lot of that in online conversations.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if I could ask you a sort of a COVID-19 related question in Russia, disinformation related to the pandemic has spread quickly and in some cases was more influential than news outlets. Skepticism around vaccines, general anxiety around the economy, all of that. The pandemic is tailor-made for a country like Russia to exploit. How do you see Russia maneuvering in this space?
Yeah, Russia doesn't have to do very much in this space. A lot of it is, as the question read, tailor-made. Unfortunately, we've seen Russia using, especially this was my favorite when we were lacking in PPE and ventilators. They sent us a plane full of that stuff, and some of those ventilators then ended up being quite faulty and catching on fire. We sent them back, but it was a huge propaganda coup for the Russian Federation because Russia had kicked out USAID in 2012, our agency for International Development. And this was a way for Russia to say, we no longer take aid from the United States, but here we are sending it to you. Look at how terrible the US response is. Look how it is, and name any fissure you want. It is not looking at our Black population enough and supporting them. It is not, dealing with school-age children the right way. I mean, really, it didn't have to make anything up, although we did see some of that kind of conspiracy theory stuff spreading around, particularly about Bill Gates and microchipping through vaccines, which is all completely false. But I think you'll find that there are plenty of Americans who espouse that stuff as well. And it didn't necessarily get seeded by Russia, but Russia, again, is just amplifying it. They don't even have to make content in this area. And in fact, a lot of the coverage on Russian state TV that I've seen isn't that far off from the reality that we're experiencing right now, which is an unfortunate and embarrassing thing to admit.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to thank you for a really rich conversation and writing this great book. I think we're right about out of time, so unfortunately I'm going to have to close it here. But
no worries. Thank you so much, Ellen, for having me, and for the Women's Foreign Policy Group for hosting us.
I'm going to add my thanks to you both for joining us today, and thank all of our participants for their excellent questions. We're sorry we can get to all of them, but hopefully next time we can get to more. If you haven't already picked up a copy of Nina's book and read it, I hope that you'll add it to your summer reading list. And we hope that all of you will stay connected, join us as a member if you aren't already, and consider signing up as one of our virtual mentors for our summer mentoring program. Because we really want to continue to elevate women's voices, help the next generation of women leaders as a big part of our mission. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.